man with the scars. In the town of Hollowbrook, whispers traveled faster than the wind. Perched on the outskirts of the village was an old, crumbling house that had stood empty for years. That was until the man moved in. He arrived one fog-laden evening, his face hidden beneath a hood. Few saw him that night, but the few who did spread tales of terror. They spoke of his towering frame, his hunched back, and the scars that crisscrossed his face like an ancient map to places no one dared venture. By morning, the rumors had solidified. The man was a monster, they said, a grotesque figure who had no place among decent folk. People avoided the house on the hill, and it wasn't long before children dared each other to run past it, just to say they had survived. No one ever knocked on the door. The man's name was Elias, though no one cared to know it. He had been a soldier once, a protector of those who now shunned him. His face, distorted by the cruelty of war, was the source of their fear. The scars, burns, and disfigurements told stories of battles fought and brothers lost. But to the people of Hollowbrook, he was simply an abomination. For weeks, Elias kept to himself, tending his garden and reading old dusty books in the solitude of his home. He never ventured into town, for he could feel the hatred without hearing the words. It radiated from every pair of eyes that dared glance his way. But as the days grew shorter and the nights darker, a strange thing began to happen. Children started disappearing. At first, it was thought they had wandered off into the dense woods and gotten lost. But soon, rumors began to swirl. Wild accusations whispered from door to door. The man in the house? It had to be him. Who else could be responsible for something so dark? Fear turned to anger, and before long, the townspeople gathered. Pitchforks and torches in hand, they marched up the hill, their hatred boiling over. The mob banged on Elias's door, demanding he come out and answer for the missing children. Elias, knowing how the world viewed him, opened the door slowly. His scarred face caught the flickering light of the torches, casting deep shadows that made him appear even more monstrous. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, his voice calm but laced with sorrow. "Where are the children?" someone shouted, a shrill voice from the back of the mob. "I don't know," Elias responded, taking a step back. "But I've seen something. Something in the woods." His words were drowned out by the angry mob. They surged forward, grabbing Elias and dragging him down the hill toward the center of town. The mayor, a tall, thin man with a cold sneer, led the charge. He had always been quick to blame those who were different. To him, Elias was an easy scapegoat, a problem to be solved. In the square, they tied Elias to a post, his face lit by the flames of their hatred. As they prepared to deliver their so-called justice, a chilling howl echoed through the town. The mob froze, fear creeping into their hearts. From the darkness of the woods, shapes began to emerge, figures twisted and grotesque, far worse than anything they had imagined Elias to be. These creatures, pale and gaunt with hollow eyes and gnarled limbs, crept toward the crowd. The townspeople recoiled in horror. They weren't ready for this. "They've been here all along," Elias said quietly, watching the terror unfold. "I tried to warn you. It wasn't me." The real monsters had been lurking in the woods, preying on the town's children, feeding off their innocence. Elias had known, he had seen them, but no one had listened. And now, the creatures were hungry again. The mob scattered in panic, their torches falling to the ground, sputtering in the dirt. As the townspeople fled, the creatures turned their attention to Elias, still tied to the post. But they did not attack. Instead, they bowed their heads in respect. For they knew he was one of the few who had fought against true monsters. Elias, with a strength no one had expected, broke free from his bindings. He turned toward the fleeing townspeople, knowing that he would never again be welcome among them. But he also knew something else. The real monsters were not the creatures in the woods. They were the people who refused to see beyond his scars, the ones who judged and hated without cause. They had created their own nightmare, and in the end, it was they who had become the true monsters. The Child of Hollowbrook. For as long as anyone could remember, Hollowbrook had been a cursed town. By day, it looked like any other village, quaint, peaceful, with cobblestone streets and ivy-covered cottages. But at night, the streets grew silent, and shutters were bolted tight. No one wandered after sunset, for they knew that something far more sinister ruled the darkness. For generations, whispers of the creature had plagued the town. A vampire, they said, an ancient being that fed on the townspeople. It didn't take children quickly. No, it was far crueler than that. It came for them slowly, draining them over time until their laughter faded, their eyes grew hollow, and their bodies frail. By the time the vampire was done, the child would vanish into the night, never to be seen again. Many had tried to stop it, hunters with silver stakes and holy water, but none returned. The vampire was too clever, too powerful. The townspeople grew to accept it as a fate they couldn't escape, like a bad harvest or a winter storm. But there was one who refused to accept the curse, a child named Mina. Mina was unlike the other children of Hollow Brook. Where others stayed indoors after sunset, she would sit by the window, watching the shadows dance across the village. She had seen the pain in her mother's eyes when her brother Liam had grown sick and weak, his life drained away by the vampire's cruel bite. Liam had disappeared 2 years ago, and since then, Mina had vowed that she would find a way to stop the monster. No one believed her. She was just a child, after all. What could she possibly do that the strongest hunters couldn't? But Mina had something they didn't: determination, and a heart that burned with love for her lost brother. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mina gathered her courage. She had overheard the elders speak of the old manor on the edge of the forest, a place they said the vampire once called home. No one dared go there, not even in daylight. But Mina had no choice. She had to find it, and she had to end this. She set off alone, clutching a small wooden stake she had carved herself. The forest was dark and tangled, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But Mina didn't waver. She moved forward, guided by an unseen force, as though something deep within her knew the way. Hours passed before she saw it, the manor looming in the distance, half hidden by mist. It was ancient and decayed, its windows shattered, its walls crumbling. But there was an eerie beauty to it, a haunting majesty that made it seem more alive than dead. Mina approached, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a grand hall lined with faded portraits and cracked mirrors. She could feel it, the presence, the evil that had tormented her town for centuries. It was here. At the center of the hall stood a figure, tall and gaunt, dressed in black velvet. His skin was pale as moonlight, his eyes gleaming red in the dim light of the room. This was the vampire, the creature who had stolen so many children from Hollow Brook. "You came," he said, his voice a silken whisper. "I've been waiting." Mina tightened her grip on the stake, trying to steady her trembling hands. "I'm here to stop you," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The vampire chuckled, a sound that echoed through the hollow halls. "A brave little girl," he mused. "But you are no different from the others. They all think they can stop me, and they all fail." Mina took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You took my brother." The vampire's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered for just a moment. "Ah, yes. Liam? He was strong. A shame he couldn't last longer." Rage surged through Mina, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I know what you are," she said. "You think you're unstoppable, but you're not. And what makes you so sure of that, child?" Mina reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. It had belonged to her brother, the last thing he had given her before he disappeared. She held it up, and the vampire recoiled slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You think that trinket will save you?" he hissed, taking a step forward. Mina didn't flinch. "No, but this will." With all her strength, she hurled the locket at him. The vampire dodged it easily, his lips curling into a sneer. But as the locket hit the ground, it shattered, releasing a brilliant flash of light. The vampire screamed, staggering back as the light enveloped him. His skin began to burn, his body twisting in agony. The locket, enchanted by her brother's love and courage, was far more powerful than any stake or silver weapon. It was made of pure hope, a force the vampire could not withstand. Mina watched as the creature crumbled to dust. His centuries of terror finally brought to an end. As the light faded, the manor grew quiet. Mina stood alone in the hall, her heart heavy but victorious. She had done it. She had saved her town, and in doing so avenged her brother. When she returned to Hollow Brook, the people stared in disbelief. The curse that had hung over them for generations was lifted. The children no longer grew sick. The shadows no longer whispered of danger. Mina had done what no one else could, but she didn't stay to bask in their praise. Instead, she walked to the edge of the forest, clutching the broken locket in her hand, and in the wind she swore she could hear Liam's voice whispering, "Thank you." The Witch of Black Hollow. In the town of Black Hollow, nestled deep within the woods, there was a woman whom everyone feared. Her name was Agatha, but most knew her only as the Witch. Her house stood at the edge of town, a crooked cottage surrounded by gnarled trees and a tangle of wildflowers that no one dared approach. Rumors clung to Agatha like the mist that rolled in from the forest every night. They said she brewed potions, cast curses, and summoned spirits. No one ever saw her in the daylight, and that alone was enough to make the townsfolk suspicious. Children would dare each other to sneak up to her house, but none ever got close. Her shadow would sometimes appear at the window, watching the world through her yellowed curtains, but never did she speak to anyone. When crops failed or strange things happened, people would mutter her name under their breath, blaming her for their misfortunes. But Agatha wasn't a witch. She had no magic, no cauldron bubbling with strange brews. What she hid was something much darker, something even she couldn't fully control. Agatha was a werewolf. It had started when she was a young woman, barely older than 20. She had been bitten on a hunting trip in the deep woods, far beyond the safety of the town's borders. The bite had burned, but it wasn't until the next full moon that the real pain came. She had felt her bones twist and break, her skin tear, as thick fur burst through her flesh. Her scream had echoed through the forest, but no one came to help. When she awoke the next morning, she had no memory of what she had done, only blood on her hands and the horror of what she had become. For decades, she lived in isolation, keeping her distance from the town, hoping that her transformation would go unnoticed. Every month, she locked herself away on the nights of the full moon, chaining herself to the walls of her cellar, trying to protect the town from the beast she became. But over time, people began to notice her absence during the day, her pale skin and sunken eyes. They whispered, and the rumors grew. Soon, it wasn't the monster they feared, but the woman they thought was a witch. One cold autumn night, as the harvest moon rose full and bright in the sky, the townsfolk gathered in the tavern, huddled around the fire. It had been a rough year. Crops had failed, livestock had gone missing, and strange howls had been heard in the woods at night. The people were frightened, and as always, they needed someone to blame. "It's her," a man muttered, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Agatha, she's behind it all." "She's cursed this town," another agreed, sipping his ale nervously. "She's a witch." As the night wore on, the talk grew louder and more heated. By midnight, a mob had formed, armed with torches and pitchforks. They marched through the streets, heading for the edge of town, for the crooked cottage where Agatha lived. Inside her home, Agatha sat by the fire, her heart pounding as she felt the change begin. She knew the moon was rising. Her bones ached, her skin itched. She had been preparing for this night, chaining herself to the cellar wall as usual, but something felt different. The beast was stronger this time, hungrier. She could sense it clawing at the edges of her mind, desperate to be free. And then she heard the shouting outside. "Come out, witch!" they cried, banging on her door. "Face us!" Agatha's eyes widened with fear. She hadn't hurt anyone, at least not knowingly, but the mob outside wasn't here to listen. They had already decided her fate. The door rattled on its hinges as they tried to force their way in. Agatha knew she couldn't let them see her like this. If they did, they would find out the truth, and the truth was far worse than they imagined. With a groan, the door gave way, and the townsfolk spilled into her home. They found her sitting at the foot of the stairs leading to the cellar, her hands gripping her arms tightly as she fought against the growing urge to shift. "Look at her," one of the men sneered, holding his torch high. "She's hiding something." Agatha looked up at them, her eyes wild. "You need to leave," she said, her voice strained. "You don't know what you're doing." But they didn't listen. They surrounded her, their torches casting flickering shadows on the walls. "We've had enough of your curses," the leader of the mob growled. "This ends tonight." Agatha felt the transformation surging, her body starting to convulse. She tried to hold it back. tried to keep herself human, but it was too late. With a scream that turned into a guttural growl, her body began to change. The townsfolk stepped back in horror as they watched her bones crack and shift, her skin stretching and tearing to reveal thick, dark fur. Her fingers lengthened into claws, her face contorted into a snarling wolf's muzzle, her eyes glowing a fierce amber yellow. She's not a witch, someone stammered. She's a monster. The room erupted into chaos as the mob fled in terror, dropping their torches and weapons as they ran for the door. But the transformation was complete, and the beast inside Agatha was unleashed. The wolf, enormous and terrifying, let out a howl that echoed through the night. It lunged at the nearest man, knocking him to the ground. Fear fueled the townsfolk as they scrambled to escape, some tumbling over each other in their frantic rush to get away. But Agatha, even in her wolf form, fought to maintain control. She couldn't let the beast take over completely. She had lived in isolation for decades to prevent something like this from happening. With a great effort, she pulled back, retreating into the darkness of her cellar, slamming the door shut behind her. The wolf inside her howled and scratched, but she held it at bay. She couldn't change what she was, but she could protect the town from herself. By morning, the mob had scattered, their torches long extinguished. The townsfolk whispered of the horror they had seen, of the creature that lived in Agatha's skin. They no longer spoke of witches or curses. Now they feared the wolf. But Agatha, weary and broken, knew that she had kept them safe, at least for one more night. The Baker of Briar Hollow. In the quiet village of Briar Hollow, tucked between misty hills and ancient woods, there was a bakery unlike any other. It sat at the heart of town, its windows warm with the glow of freshly baked bread and pies that sent waves of sweetness through the air. The baker, a stout, cheerful man named Mr. Grimsby, was beloved by all. His pastries were perfection, his cakes the stuff of dreams, but it was his pies that truly set him apart. No one knew how he made them so delicious. The crusts were impossibly flaky, golden to perfection, and the fillings, whether apple, cherry, or pumpkin, were like nothing anyone had ever tasted before. People would line up at dawn just to get a slice, and it wasn't long before stories began to spread that his pies weren't just good, they were magical. One bite, they said, could make you feel invincible. 2 bites could bring joy so deep it could erase a lifetime of sorrows. And a whole pie? Well, no one really knew what that could do, but people were willing to pay anything to find out. Mr. Grimsby never said much about his recipes. He'd smile, his round face beaming with quiet pride, and hand over the pastries, knowing they would do the talking for him. But as more and more people flocked to his shop, something strange began to happen in Briar Hollow. It started small. Mrs. Pendergast, the schoolteacher, had always been a stern woman. One day, after buying one of Grimsby's pies, she became unusually irritable. Her students reported that she snapped at them for the slightest mistake, her voice harsh and her eyes wild with frustration. Soon after, she quit her job, locking herself in her house, too afraid to face the world. Then there was old Mr. Carruthers, a kind man known for helping anyone in need. After indulging in one of the baker's pies, he grew suspicious, convinced that his neighbors were plotting against him. He took to wandering the streets at night, muttering to himself, his face drawn and pale. When he finally vanished, no one was surprised. But these were just isolated incidents, people thought. Coincidences, surely. After all, Mr. Grimsby was beloved. How could his pies be anything but a gift? Then came the Harvest Festival, the biggest event in Briar Hollow. Every year, the town would gather in the square to celebrate the bounty of the season. And this year, Mr. the Gaff Grimsby was asked to bake his famous pies for the entire town. The villagers were thrilled. What better way to celebrate than with the best pies in the land? That night, as the moon hung low and full in the sky, the villagers gathered around long tables, laughing and sharing stories. At the center of each table sat a pie, steaming and fragrant, fresh from Mr. Grimsby's oven. As the pies were sliced and served, something strange began to happen. The laughter died down. People chewed slowly, their faces growing tight, their eyes narrowing. A tense energy buzzed through the air. The joy of the festival began to fade, replaced by something darker. By the time the pies were gone, the change was undeniable. The first to snap was Mayor Weatherby, a usually kind and mild-mannered man. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair, his face twisted with fury. "You're all against me," he shouted, pointing wildly at the crowd. "You've always been against me." Others followed. Mrs. Linden, a soft-spoken seamstress, suddenly lunged at her neighbor, hissing like a feral animal. "Thief! Liar! You've been stealing from me for years!" The square erupted into chaos. People turned on each other, their eyes wild, their faces contorted into monstrous expressions. Fists flew, teeth bared. Some grew violent, while others cowered, muttering paranoid delusions to themselves. It wasn't just anger. Some began to physically change. Their hands grew claw-like, their skin pale and sickly. Eyes glowed unnaturally in the moonlight, and teeth elongated into sharp points. The townspeople were turning into monsters, twisted, hideous versions of themselves. In the middle of it all stood Mr. Grimsby, watching quietly from the shadow of his bakery. His once cheerful face was blank, emotionless, as though the chaos before him was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "What have you done to us?" a voice shrieked, and a few of the less afflicted villagers turned to face him, horror dawning in their eyes. Grimsby sighed, stepping forward with slow, deliberate steps. "You all wanted something more from life, didn't you?" he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You wanted joy, you wanted strength, you wanted to feel special, but power always comes at a cost." The crowd's eyes, though crazed, followed him, mesmerized by his words. "I've been baking these pies for years," he continued, as though speaking to an old friend. "And each time you ate them, a little more of the darkness inside you came to the surface. You see, the pies didn't create the monsters. You were always monsters. I just helped bring it out." A low growl rumbled through the crowd. The villagers, twisted and enraged, started advancing on him, their monstrous forms fully revealed. But Mr. Grimsby didn't flinch. "You can try to blame me," he said with a shrug, "but the truth is, this was always who you were. You came to my bakery hungry for more than just pies. You wanted to fill the emptiness inside. I just gave you what you asked for." The monsters lunged at him, but Grimsby was ready. With a flick of his hand, a burst of flour filled the air, thick and choking. When it cleared, the baker was gone, vanished into the night like a puff of smoke. The town of Briar Hollow was never the same after that. The villagers, once kind and welcoming, grew more fearful, more suspicious. Many locked themselves away, hiding from the monsters they had become. And though the bakery door remained closed, the sweet scent of pies sometimes drifted through the air, a haunting reminder of the price they had paid for their desires. No one ever saw Mr. Grimsby again, but the legend of the baker who made pies that turned people into monsters lived on, whispered in the shadows of Briar Hollow, a warning to those who might seek more than they deserved. The Shadow of Dreadmore. In the desolate corners of history, where most legends fade into myth, there was one name that stood apart, Vasily Dreadmore, the darkest, scariest man who ever lived. No one knew where he came from. Some claimed he was born in the black forests of Eastern Europe. Others said he came from the depths of the Arctic, where the sun never shone. But all agreed on one thing. Wherever Vasily went, darkness followed. The first stories of Vasily Dreadmore began in a small village on the edge of an ancient, sprawling forest. The village was prosperous and peaceful until one autumn night when a cold wind swept through the town. By morning, the sky was an unnatural shade of gray, and in the square a strange man stood at the well. He was tall, so tall that it seemed unnatural, his form thin and angular, as if carved from shadows themselves. His face was pale, almost skeletal, with eyes as black as pitch that glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. His clothes were dark, draped in heavy fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was his presence, the sheer weight of his being, that was most unsettling. When he looked at you, it felt as if the shadows inside your soul stirred awake. The villagers whispered that he was a sorcerer, a demon, perhaps even death himself. But Vasily never spoke. He simply stayed, watching. And then the disappearances began. At first it was animals, goats, chickens, stray dogs. They would vanish without a trace, leaving only pools of blood and strange markings in the dirt. Then, one by one, the villagers started to disappear as well. No screams were heard, no signs of struggle, just an empty house and the faint scent of decay that lingered in the air. Panic spread through the town like wildfire. Doors were barred, windows locked, but it didn't matter. Every night, Someone would vanish, and every morning Vasily Dreadmore would stand in the square as silent and still as a tombstone. No one dared confront him. The few who tried, strong men with axes and torches, never returned. It was as if they had walked into the forest, swallowed by the dark, never to be seen again. The villagers began to believe that Vasily wasn't a man at all, but something far worse, something ancient and malevolent, sent to punish them for sins they didn't even know they'd committed. It wasn't long before the entire village fell into ruin. Those who could escape fled, and those who remained were claimed by the darkness. The village, once full of life, became a ghost town shrouded in mist and silence. And through it all, Vasily Dreadmore remained. But his story didn't end there. Over the centuries, tales of Vasily spread far and wide, carried by survivors and travelers who had encountered his chilling presence. Wherever he went, terror followed. A once thriving city would crumble into despair, crops would wither, and the people would turn on each other, driven mad by fear. Some claimed that Vasily was immortal, cursed to wander the earth for eternity. Others believed that he was a herald of doom, sent to warn of impending disaster. But the darkest rumors suggested something far more sinister, that Vasily Dreadmore was not merely an omen of destruction, but the very embodiment of it. There were stories of entire kingdoms that had fallen after his arrival, castles reduced to rubble, their rulers driven to madness or suicide, rivers ran dry, and forests withered to dust. Wherever Vasily went, nature itself recoiled, as if even the land feared him. It was said that Vasily's power came not from magic, but from the darkness that lived inside him, a darkness so profound that it could consume everything around it. Those who looked into his eyes were said to glimpse their deepest fears, their worst nightmares. And once you saw those nightmares, they never left you. One of the most terrifying stories told of a small, remote monastery high in the mountains. The monks who lived there had dedicated their lives to the study of ancient texts, seeking enlightenment through prayer and meditation. But when Vasily Dreadmore arrived, the monastery changed. At first, the monks tried to welcome him, offering food and shelter. But Vasily never ate, never slept. He simply sat in the monastery's great hall, silent and unmoving. The monks began to grow uneasy. One by one, they found themselves waking in the middle of the night, gasping for breath as if they had been drowning in their sleep. And then the dreams began. The monks dreamed of darkness, endless, suffocating darkness. In their dreams, they were alone in a vast void, with only Vasily's eyes watching them from the shadows. Every night, the dreams grew worse, the darkness pressing in closer, until the monks could no longer distinguish between waking and sleeping. Driven mad by fear, the monks turned on each other. Their once peaceful monastery became a battleground, stained with blood and fire. By the time travelers arrived to investigate the smoke rising from the mountain, they found nothing but ruins. Vasily Dreadmore was gone. He left no footprints, no signs of life. Only the stories remained. And so the legend of Vasily Dreadmore grew. His name became a warning, a whispered threat to those who would dare to defy the unknown. He was the man who walked in shadows, the man who brought nightmares to life. He was the darkest soul ever to walk the earth, a force of nature more terrifying than death itself. Some say that Vasily Dreadmore still walks the earth, wandering from town to town, leaving destruction in his wake. Others believe that he is nothing more than a ghost story, told to scare children at night. But those who have looked into his eyes, those who have felt the chill of his presence, know the truth. Vasily Dreadmore was real, and he was darkness incarnate.